Hello, everyone. Welcome to You Thought You Knew, the podcast where we talk about Survivor players that are underrated, underappreciated, or just misunderstood. Each episode, we'll try to answer a question that's designed to make us challenge our preconceived notions about a famous Survivor contestant. Of course, there are no right answers. It's just an excuse to talk about our favorite show. I'm your co-host, Nigel Bocanegra, and as always, I'm joined by my husband, Kevin McLain.
Yes, excited to be here. Start of a new season. This is our 14th episode, Nige.
Wow, 14 episodes. The Fiji of this podcast, if you will.
Yes. So it's an exciting thing to be doing today. I think it's a great topic, and we have a great guest.
Yes, we are joined today by the one and only Matt Scott. Matt, how are you?
I'm phenomenal. Not the one and only Matt Scott. There are way too many out there, but there is only one Yul Kwan, and I am thrilled to talk about Yul today. So thanks for having me.
I think you make a fair point. There probably is at least one other Matt Scott out there in the world, but it is the one Yul Kwan that we'll be speaking about today. Mm-hmm. Kevin, are you excited to be talking about Yul Kwan?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept that we're approaching it because I think Yul is universally liked, but maybe not loved. I feel like he's not the most memeable person in the world. He has a bit more of a reserved personality, but I think he also, there's something about him that has made him a popular figure throughout. I mean, people have been clamoring for him to return since season 13, and he finally does by season 40. So I'm really excited to talk about Yul.
Fantastic. Well, do you want to give us your typical Talking with T-Bird-esque introduction on Yul?
Please.
Yes. All right. Yul Kwan's win in Cook Islands felt like another clear victory for brains over brawn. But when the American public voted for their favorite of the season, Ozzy won decisively, unlike Yul's narrow win of jury votes. Yul feels like someone that could run for president, but he does seem to underperform with the casual audience. Did Yul's sense of polish and camera awareness hurt him as a character? He's brilliant, articulate, and impressive, but is Yul Kwan a gamebot? Early on, viewers hear Yul express hesitation and discomfort at the season's race twist. This is particularly clear in his and the rest of the Asian American Puka Puka tribe's concerns over cowboys' humor regarding Asian stereotypes. Despite significant airtime, Yul is relegated to strategic narration over deep personal moments for much of the season. You thought you knew Yul Kwan? Well, we think we do. And on this episode of You Thought You Knew, we will be answering the question, is Yul Kwan a gamebot?
So, Matt, how does that introduction sit with you?
It sits pretty well with me. I feel like Yul in this moment because I relate so much to him. He's just so reasonable, logical, measured, diplomatic. And I feel like that introduction is fair. Maybe that's not the most exciting thing, but also, Yul would probably say the same thing. It's a fair introduction. I also think it's fascinating when we look at Cook Islands to contrast these two big characters between Yul and Ozzy. And I mean, I know there are a lot of reasons out there that Ozzy would have a lot of fans, maybe some only fans, but Yul has definitely aged well with the community over time, and so we'll get into it. But I love this question of if Yul's a gamebot because, spoiler, when we started to talk about this episode and when I dove into the topic of if he's a gamebot, I would just say yes automatically, but it's a lot more nuanced than that, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, and the term gamebot is kind of used pretty liberally. I mean, if you just don't like someone, they could be a gamebot. If you just think someone's intelligent, they might turn into a gamebot. It's really all about how you're using it. And so I feel like, these are the opportunities to discuss these terms and figure out if Yul is a good fit for it.
I think that's a good point. And, even people who get personal content on the show, I think if it's not complex enough or not new enough, not deep enough, people may still refer to them as a gamebot, even though there is a little bit of personal content there. I mean, Matt, what do you think of when you think of the gamebots of Survivor?
Yeah, so I think this is the core of this podcast today, where we sort of need to define what we mean by a gamebot. When I think of a gamebot, well, I think of someone who is motivated by strategy. It's really hard to define a gamebot by just what we get on the show. And I mean, Survivor is a series where we only get depictions of the characters on the shows. There aren't live feeds, so we don't have that to influence us. But, I did Google some of the different definitions out there. And, one of the definitions I saw really spoke about a gamebot as a player who seems devoid of emotion and empathy because they're so focused on the game. They're thought to view other players like chess pieces, which again, interesting conversation to have about Yul. I don't know if that fully captures who he is, but I do think if we stick with that definition of not just a strategic player, but someone who is devoid of emotion or empathy, then that really does weed out a lot of people, because the show could give us whatever edit it wants. We've seen many seasons where we don't get people's personalities and characteristics and instead just get their strategy. So I think it's a bit more than just the strategy element being highlighted in their story. The gamebot is a lot more than that.
And I think like devoid of empathy, that it's giving sociopath, right? Which I don't think Yul is, right?
No.
But I do think it's someone who, you're constantly cutting back to them to give strategic content. You want a soundbite about where the game is going, what numbers are on the table, what you do. This is the gamebot. And gamebots can be popular. And I think when I think of gamebot, I think of like Kim Spradlin in One World as kind of gamebot, like, very intelligent, articulate, and obviously very dominating in the game. So you constantly cut to them to explain the strategic layout of the season, because if you're not going to ask her, you're going to ask Kat Ederson. Like, no, like, of course she's going to be a bit more of a gamebot. And I think the critique of gamebot depictions is that, we get so much time with this person, and why do we only hear about your strategic understanding of the game? Why isn't there more to you? And I do think Yul kind of fits some of those elements. But do you think Matt's definition was a good one?
I actually really like the definition that you brought up, Matt, because when I think of a gamebot, I think that my gut reaction is to think of, all of the things you're describing, but someone who is coming off that way on television because of the edits that they were given. I truly believe that if you're on that island for at least 26 days, you gave them enough content to appear not like a gamebot if they chose to. But I think that touching on some of like the specific things that you were mentioning of like not being very emotional about the decisions, looking at other people's chess pieces is an interesting way to kind of like go beyond just what you were edited as, but also like some of their typical behavior too, because you can be excellent at narrating strategy and like where things stand. I kind of think of Carolyn when she is with, I'm totally blanking on the names right now, but when she's having the tattoo discussion with the two guys.
With Danny and Brandon.
Yes, thank you. I think in the way that she carries herself and she talks, she's so interesting and unique. It doesn't feel like gamebot, but she's getting a lot of content describing, picking up on the fact that they are not listening to her and not really giving her like the time of day. And, I think that you could call that strategic content, right? But it also very much feels personal too. So I think it's interesting to try and like parse out where we see those differences around Yul's game here. So Kevin, do you want to give us some of the quick hit facts about Yul and his time on Survivor?
Sure. So Yul played on the 13th season Cook Islands. He played it as a 31-year-old from San Mateo, California, which is where Nige is from, actually. So
we were in the same district for our high school sports, so very close.
But not the same age group. Now you are.
I mean, I would have never played against Yul, but we were, close enough where we grew up.
And he's most known for being the chief strategist of the I-24, helping his alliance reach the final four, despite being outnumbered 8-4 after the season's important mutiny twist. He in a 5-4 vote, Yul wins Survivor Cook Islands and becomes the first Asian American winner of Survivor, the first winner to win it in a final three, and the first winner to have found a hidden immunity idol. So, he checks off a lot of things early on. And I should also note here that the idol that he found was the super idol or god idol, which is the one that can be played after the votes are read. And Yul found that on his sole trip to Exile Island. And I think this points to his brilliance is that he found it in episode 2. So he barely had any clues. And it also meant everyone following him never had a chance of finding it. So Candace, who was sent 4 times over, she was never going to find it. And so he eventually returns for Survivor Winners at War season 40, where he finishes in 14th place, which solidified a trend of the old school winners being eliminated pre-merge. So that's Yul for you.
Thanks, Kev. So, Matt, can you remind me, what was your journey in finding Cook Islands and seeing Yul live? Because I actually, when I went to watch old seasons, since I joined during Cagayan, Cook Islands was my second to last season. So I'd seen almost everything else by the time I got there.
Well, let me tell you something. I'm so honored to be here, in part because Yul is my winner. Just like Parvati, when we spoke about Parvati, queer queen Parvati a year ago. Yul's my winner. That was my first season, and part of that was the race twist drawing me, and part of that was also just how my relationship with reality TV at the time. But Yul was the introduction I had to how this game could be played, and rewatching Cook Islands, rewatching Yul's highlights, like, it is so clear to me why I fell in love with this show, because he put on a masterclass of how to play this game that I think still holds up. A lot of the other parts of the season, of course, don't hold up for various, mostly racial reasons, but like, Yul's performance definitely holds up.
And so what were some of your favorite moments from Yul's time on Cook Islands? Is there anything that stands out that you really remember from your initial watch?
I mean, my mind always goes to Yul and Ozzy and Parvati in a hot tub. So that was what one of the things I remember from this season in retrospect. But, Yul had such a measured way of going about the game. One of the things I actually appreciated most about Yul, beyond the strategy itself, was how his reads of other people were so strong. Like when he, picked up with, Becky, the fact that she would be someone who'd play the game in a really logical way, and someone who worked with nonprofits, and someone who would play in this game for a reason that's like bigger than the game. And so he said, I could work with her. And then I also thought it was fascinating how he worked with Jonathan Penner, because Penner was perceived as this rat, this snake, probably called the worst names ever. Yul didn't seem to understand why that was the case, and ended up picking up Penner over the course of the season. And it turns out, like, to date, they're still insanely close. And I really credit Yul for his choices in who he could work with, who he should keep in the game, and who he should get rid of. Absolutely. That, those were a lot of logical choices, but also proved that he was really good at reading people and understanding people dynamics, relationships, motivations, all that more human stuff.
Yeah, Yul gives consultant 100%. I mean, everything feels, it's so analytical from like a management perspective. He always wants what's the for, what's the group, what's the process, where's the redundancy, and like, it's why he's an effective person. But you know what? I loved Yul during my first watch. Being, I don't know how old was I, 12 probably or so, when Cook Islands was going on, because he's this Asian American, winner. It was so exciting. I was so glad he beat Ozzy. I was like, there's no way we're allowing a challenge beast to win. Rich beat Kelly, Tina beat Colby. We have a precedent. So it was really important for me for Yul to win, and to see that was super exciting, though I was a low-key Becky fan at the time. And
still am.
I've kind of turned on Becky a little bit, to be quite honest.
Wow.
So here's the thing. Yul was one of my favorites early on, because Cook Islands was a popular season too. I think as my Survivor taste had started to develop, and I realized I loved the train wreck players more. Who
doesn't?
And like, what seasons was I rewatching? Gabon, Panama, Nicaragua. Yul doesn't really fit into that. And there, a part of me started becoming like, Yul's kind of an uptight stiff. And I don't know if I can love Yul and love this perspective that I've developed over Survivor, which is that you should be more energetic, enthusiastic, human, if you will. And so there's a lot of things where I felt like I respected Yul, but was not considered a Yul fan. at a time in my life. Now that time has passed, and seeing him return again, I feel like I have a much more, I have a real appreciation for Yul. But there is something about Yul that I feel like you can critique, because I mean, he's kind of a flawless person, but even in that sense, as like a Drag Race term you would use, where is the vulnerability? And I feel like that is my biggest issue with Yul as a character, which I'm sure we'll get into.
He, in your opinion, is almost suffering from being a little too perfect, right?
It's giving perfect. I mean,
it is.
And let me tell you, I mean, great for regular life. Really, reality television is one of the few places you would say that is like remotely a downside in any way, right? Matt.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure that we'll talk more about this. But yeah, it is interesting because Yul is a fascinating character in Survivor lore. He's not the biggest character, but because there aren't a ton of characters like him, he stands out a bit. Like, sure, give us one perfect king, once every 30 seasons or so. Like, I could do that.
And, Matt, you mentioned as one of your favorite moments when he's talking with Becky, she's a lawyer who does nonprofit work. I wrote that down as my number one moment because that is the most Washington, D.C. thing I have ever heard in my life. And it reminded me of living back there. But, as I was reviewing and going back to Yul moments in Cook Islands, I was just really struck by how well he handled himself in negotiations with Jonathan Penner and trying to pull him over. And I loved the arguments he was having with Candace and Parvati, where they were like, yeah, Yul, and you said that Jonathan was selfish. And Yul said, I said he was a self-interested, rational player. And Candace said, selfish.
Lie.
Back in like selfish. And I really love that they're heated and they're making it personal, right? Like, Yul, you said that you don't like Jonathan. You said he's selfish. And Yul is in that moment, as he's being confronted, able to still pull back and go to what is like maybe the safe response, but is still probably true to Yul. And I think that that's a little bit of like the perfect issue, is that he does put on a masterclass, like you said, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also point out there that some of my other favorite moments of Yul that are pretty underrated are just the moments he gets fired up, like when he is going back and forth with Candace at different points, with Adam at different points. He is a perfect character, but I'll also point out, I won't say he's a perfect character, he's a perfect person, and a character in this game. But you know what? We always say representation matters. We need some perfect people on our TVs, or else, like, what are we gonna do? Like, how are we gonna know how to be perfect, Kevin?
But what I think is really interesting here, Matt, is that you say one of the things you like about Yul is when he's like being fired up, which does not happen often because Yul is reserved. And I think that's maybe a question to kind of entertain here is, Yul's level-headedness, his rationality, his professionalism almost mean that we're going to get those elements way like fewer times in the season, right? He's not going to pop off. I mean, he's like the anti-Abby Maria, right? Like, he's not, everything is so constrained. So maybe because he holds back a little bit more, it really excites us when we get the little bit of pieces, here and there. But I definitely feel like there were times where we could have seen his humanity a bit more. And I think it's important to acknowledge the constraints he was under in Cook Islands, right? Because my favorite Cook Islands player is Cowboy, because he's a problematic Asian, and so am I. I'm mostly just kidding, right? But like, I kind of loved, at the time of Cook Islands, we're kind of in this colorblind era of reality television, and in the discourse too. Barack Obama kind of runs on a colorblind concept of racial meritocracy in the US. That's not how we talk about race today by any means. And so Yul is very frustrated with Cowboy, and as many of the other contestants on the tribe, because it's like he's making all these jokes, and like, that is how I would talk with my friends about the ridiculousness of all of this, how stupid it is they talk about these things, but it forces him to be so serious in a way. And generally, I want people to be less serious on Survivor. I want people to have more fun. And I think it takes time for Yul to loosen up, but those times are really cool. And it just sometimes, I feel like I can struggle with the fact that he just doesn't always want to give us so much. And actually, Winners at War, I feel like we get so much more of a loosened up Yul, and that's why Winners at War Yul is actually higher on my overall rating.
Totally.
Kevin, do you remember how old Yul is in Cook Islands?
31.
So,
Oh my gosh.
when he plays, he's 31. The only two winners of color that preceded him are Sandra and Vesepia out of 12 winners, right? He hits the beach and is divided by race. I mean, you hear him vocalizing that.
And they don't know it's going to happen. I mean, that's another
They
thing.
don't know
You're
what's
not
going to
prepared for
happen.
it.
I mean, can you imagine hitting the beach and having that just like sprung on you? That totally like
I would
shifts
quit.
your entire paradigm.
You would quit.
I would quit immediately. I'm like, oh my gosh, I would feel so betrayed. Like, I mean, if that happened in 2024, could you imagine how, like, I would rally all of the people of color and even the white people, and we would walk off that beach. What, like, you can't blindside us like that. But back then, when Cook Islands came out, like, I guess it, I'm not surprised that that was a twist that happened. I would also say, Yul is someone who, in the season, in his confessionals, but also after the season, talks about how important it was for him to represent Asian Americans. And he was so involved in representing Asian Americans in media, in hosting roles, and so much after the season. So it's very clear that he took this seriously, this role of representing very seriously. And it's also interesting because representation has continued to evolve since Cook Islands came out. Obviously, this was such a sexy, salacious season because of the fact that the representation wasn't there, particularly on Survivor. And so I get how he was a bit uptight about things. I also, and we'll talk more about this, but Yul is just a pretty uptight person. So there's that. But then you compound that with the weight of being like Asian American representation and the first Asian American winner. Is he the first? Yeah, the first Asian winner. Like, that's a lot.
And he's the third like Asian man. Him, Brad, and Cowboy kind of come together because I think only preceding him is Daniel Liu and Bruce in Panama. So, you're really kind of foraying into this new territory. And I totally get why. And again, this podcast is more about character analysis and appreciation. And so I feel like through that lens, I want to critique Yul's characterization as definitely a bit stiff. I mean, it's probably why he's super successful in real life, right? I mean, someone who's very disciplined, fair-minded are great. But, Cowboy is also representation, right? And representation isn't always positive. So it feels like a lot of respectability politics, which has its value, especially in that time. So I definitely found it very interesting. I mean, Yul felt like the first player to feel like they could run for Congress. I mean, truly, he felt so professional. And have an Asian American on television also do that at that time had a lot of meaning. I just think, it would also have been nice if you also could have been a little messy for me. But that's all I want to say.
But that's not Yul, right? And that's one thing that's fascinating because he is like kind of weird in the ways that he's not weird, if you know what I'm saying. Like, even how he talks about Cowboy is so fascinating to me because everyone's talking about Cowboy. Like, is he racist? Is he insensitive? Is he crazy? Is he outdated? All these things. And it jumped out to me that Yul says something. He basically says, like, Cowboy's an interesting guy. Like, I wrote him off as being insane, but like there are some bits of brilliance within there. So even Yul is couching Cowboy in having some value, which nobody else. Maybe Flicka. I don't hope
Flicka and Ozzy.
Sure.
I believe Ozzy said maybe it was a Game Changers pre-show, something around this time era of the show. They were asked, who from your season deserves another chance? And Ozzy says Cowboy more than anyone. And I was like, Cowboy, he's like a pre-merger and all of that. But I definitely think Yul is very fair, and he sees the utility and the intelligence of everyone around him, right? He doesn't underestimate anyone. He's always very fair, and he's very analytical. And I think all those things are great. I just wish he made me laugh more, perhaps. Maybe that's where it really comes from, because I really love the very fun, uncontrollable characters, and he's so controlled. But I feel like he is almost the model, the prototype of the controlled reserved person, that he's now interesting because he's that. Like all him wanting to align with Becky because she works in nonprofits is so Yul. And it's funny actually when you think about it in those ways. And that's how I've come to appreciate Yul in the way that you appreciate a wine. You know, it's like I'm sensing notes of consultant, notes of intelligence, notes of fair, you know, all of that's happening there with Yul.
Yeah.
And you know, it is interesting to think like, what would Yul have been like had he shown up and it was like the Panama twist where it's just divided by age and he did not feel like he had the same responsibility of representation on his shoulders as he does in the way that Cook Islands splits the cast. And I think you could look to Winners at War as him not having that same sense of duty on his shoulders, but he's so much older. And, you know, maybe at 31, he would have been a little looser, but I think maybe 23, 24-year-old Yul would have been like the prime loosest version of him. But he's, you know, in his early 30s by the time.
He was probably wild back then, like doing keg stands, all sorts of stuff that they did back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But like to me, I know that none of us would know anything about this, but Yul is the quote unquote straight man, so to speak. Like everyone bounces off of him very well, I think, you know, because it points out the absurdity of all these other characters in Cook Islands. I mean, Yul could have been out there too, and I think we would have still gotten that from the different characters. But you know, he does serve a purpose, even though it's not the most exciting one.
Yeah, and I think that kind of maybe circles back to the major question, because I don't know if we fully answered it yet, which is Yul Kwan a gamebot?
Ooh.
So Kevin, what do you think?
Uh-oh.
Is Yul a gamebot?
Yes, I think Yul is a gamebot. I think he's a good gamebot, but I think he is a gamebot. I think it's unfair. I think he totally fits that package. What do you think, Nige?
So I think I want to disagree just in case we end up with unanimous opinion here. I don't think he's exactly a gamebot. I think you really have to bring in his Winners at War outing in order to move him out of gamebot status. When I was preparing and looking at Yul moments, I think what I actually really enjoyed is that he is so clean and polished, but seeing the little nuances and little moments that I think actually give him a lot more character edge was really fun to see. So I'm going to say he's not exactly a gamebot.
Are you about to ask me my opinion? Oh my gosh,
your opinion?
I'm not ready. I'm not ready for it.
You're on
I'm
the
not
spot.
ready. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't expecting it coming on this podcast. No, it's really interesting. I do not believe that Yul is a gamebot, and I think he's very robotic in many ways. We could talk more about that because I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about Yul, and there are the strategic elements of what we get with Yul. Yul admits himself really using game theory and math in how he plays the game. But I would also say there's no one better at reading people, at emotional intelligence in this game. And it's fascinating though, because back then in this era of Survivor, we just didn't have as many people who were as adept at playing this game. So for me, the thing that leaves Yul slightly out of gamebot territory is his empathy, is his ability to really understand and read people and relate to them pretty flawlessly throughout this game. Again, in contrast to so many others in the game, there are a lot of things that we see with him that are more robotic. So is he more robotic? Maybe, but there's definitely a conversation to be had there about like stoicism and culture. And he even talks about just his upbringing in a Korean family and all these other things that I think tie in with how he portrays himself, or how he, goes for this perfect portrayal of himself. I don't know if it's beyond this podcast or not, but definitely interesting things for us to talk about with stoicism and just culture with all of it. But I don't think that should be conflated with being a gamebot, because when I think of gamebots, I think of like Spencer from Kage-On as an example. Kim Spradlin's a good example of this. Yul is more than a gamebot to me. You too.
I think that's a great answer, and I can't wait to explore that a bit more. I feel like it's in line with my philosophy that Yul's like Gamebot Plus. You know, it's like a
Yeah.
Hulu Plus subscription. He's a little bit more than a Gamebot, but I feel like his base level is Gamebot. He's programmed for strategic optimization and success. And I feel like that's a huge
Yeah.
element to Yul. And I think it's an element of also appreciating Yul is knowing that too. And I think when we actually get into it a bit more, I love to kind of analyze the weaknesses in Yul's game because he's so perfect, but like no one's perfect, especially not on Survivor. And I feel like that will be the interesting thing to challenge in this podcast. So Nigel, are we ready to jump into some data or anything else beforehand?
Data,
Yeah.
Yul's favorite thing.
Yul's favorite thing. Yeah, Kev, I
Mhm.
think we're ready. So, Matt, as you know, Kevin always does research ahead of the podcast recording to prepare us here. Kev, you did some research to get an understanding of what the general consensus is that you're able to find from the fan base of what are people's thoughts on Yul today?
Yeah. So first I went on to Reddit, did some research there. First I found some articles asking who are the biggest game bots. Top comments include Chanel for the modern era. Her game was defined by overthinking strategically and underestimating the social game. Someone else said Kim Spradlin and her many, many, many options. Some people also seem to reference Kelly Wentworth, Spencer Bledsoe. So there's definitely conversations about game bots.
And, actually, Kev, what stands out to me a little bit is, you're mentioning Kim, Spencer, Kelly Wentworth. These are all people who premiere in the second half of this show, like much later on. And it's interesting that we're talking about Yul as a game bot. And can you think of many game bots from like 1 through 12?
So I think there's fewer in the early ones. I feel like game bots probably start to emerge once you have to talk about splitting votes a lot. I think that's where you're probably getting the huge surge in like gamebot commentary. But I think early season gamebots do exist. I would argue like Greg Carey of Palau, Burton Roberts of Pearl Islands have some gamebot tendencies because just like Yul, they're kind of maybe a little bit more reserved, professional in their demeanor, intelligent, analytical. But I think you're onto something about it being less common in the early era.
And for even those two folks you just named, neither of them get all that much airtime in their seasons. I mean, like Burton certainly more so than Greg, but I wouldn't say that either of them are like super exposed to us in a way that Yul obviously gets far more content, and he is the winner of the season, right? But I do think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and I also have another thread here, which is who is your favorite game bot? And someone says, mine is Yul Kwan. Majority opinion on here seems to be that Yul is a snooze. But what can I say? I thought there was something really compelling about his story. He seems very bewildered throughout by his own gamebottishness. And something about watching his undoubtedly very nice man trying to adjust to a reality where everyone's calling him the Godfather was weirdly fascinating to me. So I do think Yul is a game bot. I mean, people are literally referencing him in discussions around game bots, but even in that, they kind of talk about how using that as a way to understand him as someone in relation, as the straight man, as Matt said.
Yeah. I know. I agree. I think it's not surprising that he comes up in the conversation. I just think that we need to better define what a game bot is in those conversations. Because I did some of my research too. I said, let me put on my Kevin hat right now and go into Reddit, a place that I do not venture often. But I really went there and I saw a lot of the posts that you're talking about. But a lot of what was missing in those conversations was, okay, how are we defining this? Is it just the strategic element, or are we saying that this person is devoid of humanity? Which we have had many characters who do not like, they cannot read the room. I'm sure both of you could think of many characters, many players like that on this show. But Yul doesn't fall into that category. So I do love the characterization of him as Gamebot Plus. That's fancy. I'd pay $9.99 for that one.
And you know what? When I search in Yul, I feel like quite often what comes up, conversations about strategy, like, and his
Mhm.
game. And so I feel like that does point to some elements, to him being kind of gamebot. Like, I found threads saying, can we talk about how well Yul played in season 13? And Yul Kwan is the best social player ever. Changed my mind. Other people had mentioned, or threads, why is Yul considered such a great winner? I mean, all of these things have in common an interest in analyzing Yul as a player before as a person. And I think that in itself points to certain ways that we digest and think about Yul and his legacy.
I think that actually is like a really great point that you make, Kevin, because, I think that this also is very possible part of how just Yul communicates and processes information, because very early on in Cook Islands, one of his opening confessionals, he talks about his Asian American identity and being ostracized to a degree at times in his childhood for that, and tells a story of his family's Christmas decorations being ruined by people in the neighborhood. And he, alludes to it being in part related to his Asian identity and being other from the people around him. And, Yul does get into that. That's one of like the very first things that he talks about with his handler while he's out there, right? But I do wonder if Yul really does fall back so much into those analytical skills, the professionalism that he has, that as he's seeing these crazy people around him, some larger than life characters, he really goes back into that analysis mode of like looking at what is in front of him and providing us like commentary on that, rather than speaking to his own past experiences and continuously connecting that to what he sees in a way that I think a lot of other people throughout the show's history have ended up doing.
Yeah, I also think that's a great point, and this is where I struggle with Survivor a bit, especially in that era, because like, what were the confessionals like as he sat down for hours with whoever was asking questions? Were they asking him about strategy? Did they perceive him in a way where he would be the smart one, the strategic one? Or did they say, let's dive into your childhood traumas a bit more? Like, it's fascinating to think about that. And we really have no way of knowing. Yul is not on this podcast right now, for better or for worse. I feel like he might, if he were on this podcast, maybe it'd be a little bit less fun and exciting. No offense to Yul, but he like outside of the game, if you just look at his LinkedIn. I'm assuming he's on LinkedIn, but look at his resume. Look at what
of course
he does.
he's on LinkedIn. It's Yul.
He is like he according to his Wikipedia, he's worked for the FBI. He's worked for like Facebook developing algorithms. I was listening to a podcast that he did a couple of years ago now, where he was talking about like working on contact tracing at Google for the pandemic. And I'm like, sir, this is how you think. This is how your brain processes information. This is also another reason why I'm not so big on the gamebot characterization, because I just think he's kind of just a bot in life a bit, so I don't know, I'm kind of curious to distinguish between like the game bots versus the nerds, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so can we think of a nerd that's not a game bot? Because I feel like, yeah, they exist.
Okay. Yeah. Let's
David Wright.
Yeah.
Christian
Hubicki. That's great. Even John Cochran, right? Like, I mean,
Ooh,
so I feel like if I was to critique, I mean, Yul could be more colorful.
Yeah.
But
I would say Cochran too was more of a game bot his first season, and then we saw his character develop more and more. But I'm with you. Those were all great examples.
But Matt, as you read some facts from Yul's Wikipedia, what struck me is Yul like the most well-adjusted person to have ever been on reality television? I mean, working for the FBI, contract tracing during COVID, like this does not strike me as someone that would be on reality television. And maybe that is part of why Yul does feel so unique and interesting to us, that we've had plenty of Gamebots along the way. But Yul is very, very successful. He worked for the Obama administration at one point.
I believe
correct,
so.
Kevin.
Right.
I mean,
I'm
he's
sure.
he's extremely accomplished, and not many people going down a career path like that can afford to take off the amount of time that was needed to be on a show like Survivor.
How dare you? Philip Shepard and Debbie Wanner. Come on, 2 names. That's all I have to give
Debbie,
you.
that's true. Debbie has had every job.
And you know what's interesting
Yes.
is that Yul is one of the, in my opinion, one of the original Gamebots. Works because it's like at that time we wanted
Right.
new strategists and
Mhm.
people that were going to change the game up and think about it in all those ways and overcome those deficits. Now, today, give me no more Gamebots, because it's
Yeah.
different. So I want to challenge the notion of who I feel like is a Yul Kwan clone, if you will, James
Oh.
Lim of Survivor Ghost Island, who is kind of packaged in a similar way to Yul, goes out a bit earlier, and who I actually really like. I actually like James Lim a lot. But
Oh.
like it's kind of a game bot. I think if you think about his edit, the way that he's kind of depicted on screen, and Yul could have easily just been someone like that at a different time. I think he really fits in very neatly in Cook Islands, and I actually think his game botness makes him a good character because he's in the contrast to the bratty raros, the Parvati, Adams,
Yeah.
Nates of the world that are just so different than he is. So his maturity is really refreshing in that sense. But like,
Yeah.
if Yul was on, I mean, Yul is not someone who should be on reality TV. I'd argue in most reality TV shows. I think Survivor, because it's an analytical, strategic game, it really does work. But I feel like that still gives Gamebot.
I'll also just I'll put it out there. Yul works so well for this season because you do need some characters across each of the races. I get that's how we're dividing people.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you need a character on each of those tribes, at least one who you could just take seriously and respect. Because look, if he was messy, then like we need that. We need that like stoic representation here. I am not as big of, I hope James isn't listening. I'm not as big of a fan of James as I am of Yul. But I think part of that, and maybe this is skipping ahead to Winners at War a bit, but we see why Yul's out there playing, and you could tell he has a big heart. There is a gap in terms of how he expresses his emotion and the emotions that clearly he has somewhere in that body of his. But I do think that Yul is he's just very likable. You could tell he's like the Tin Man. He has a heart.
And Yul, people talk about Yul's time in Cook Islands and ask, like, would he have won if he didn't have the God Idol, right? Statistically, no one wins on any given season of Survivor, right? You're starting with 16, 18, 20 people. Realistically, no one is ever likely to win a season. But I think if you were going to look on paper, Yul is someone who feels like one of the safest bets from production, where that he will do a great job of describing the strategy for you, to be able to narrate, and like, what are Yul's obvious weaknesses? Maybe he won't be going really far into the competition necessarily. Things happen, people get swapped, but he's definitely not popping up, I think, as like any obvious early target, right? And to think of James Lim, I actually don't think that's a bad comparison at all. He definitely has that like Ivy League vibe about him. And I think it actually makes me feel even more confident about Yul having this like special something that's there, because I think that he does not have that same level of like stiltedness in my mind, even though he's like so clean, the edges are rounded. He feels so like ready for TV, but there's still like a little something there that's a little hard for me to articulate at times.
Yeah. I do want to talk about his game a little bit. This is mostly character appreciation, but it's hard to discuss Yul's legacy without talking about his game, because I think people see it as like really perfect, but let's remind ourselves that Yul does only win by 1 vote. I mean,
I have a theory on this, but continue.
I mean, how Matt, what do you think about that? I mean, if Yul's so perfect, if his EQ is so high, why did he barely win?
The cast was a mess. He deserved better. Also, Ozzy, like it's so funny to me because we didn't get Yul back on this show until Winners at War. Obviously, he won the season, so I mean, there are a lot of winners that we've only seen play one time, or their last time playing was when they won. But I mean, Ozzy, the flowing hair, the Jungle Boy personality, like Ozzy is just so I think a compelling person. You could also argue that Ozzy is off-putting in many ways, as I believe Penner points out in the final tribal, like calling him a cocky young kid or something to that effect. So yeah, it is interesting that there was only one vote dividing them, but that was $1 million vote. Like I don't know if it's hard for me to say it was that close, but also we're just watching the show, so I can't really speak for the jury with this one. But I mean, one vote makes all the difference. Who's giving Ozzy $1 million back in Cook Islands days? I guess the answer would be everyone who voted for him.
Yeah,
but
exactly. Nearly a majority. And so I just bring that up just to kind of challenge some of the notions, because I think it's so easy to be like, Yul's perfect, because he kind of is.
Yeah.
But like,
Mhm.
well, everyone has weaknesses. So Nigel, I know you wanted to comment on this.
So,
Please.
I think first, let's not underestimate Ozzy as a competitor for that final vote, right? I mean, Ozzy could have won another season as well, right? Like, he is someone who's absolutely in the mix, can get votes. Maybe he doesn't win, but he's competitive. And what I kind of like about the I Choose is that they very much feel like a group that was put together because their teacher assigned the group project
Yeah.
to 4 people that were in that class, right? Like, Ozzy and Yul are not a part of the same clique. That's not the
Mhm.
vibe from them. But they definitely feel like people who could be friends because they were in a group project, and maybe they're not always hanging out after school together, but they are
No.
friendly. And at the end of the day, Ozzy's like cool and Yul's kind of a nerd. And
Yeah.
cool people are popular. And I actually
Yeah.
think that like our culture has changed to value nerds a lot more, and like so-called nerdy hobbies are far more popular today than they were when Yule first played, right? But like, I don't know, I think the cool kid is always someone that you want to be like a little on guard for, as someone who could like end up winning the whole thing. So I think that like Yule, highly competent, really safe, but like you have some like kooky people out there that maybe are not the person that's going to most jive with you at all times. People
Yeah.
certainly respected him, but I mean, I do think that that's probably part of why he wins 5-4.
I mean, I think the other piece of this, to your point, Nigel, like Ozzy, his game is just so flashy and impressive. It not from the game standpoint, like we would define it, not from the strategic standpoint at all. But if you're out there, like I actually think of Rebecca at the final tribal, who hadn't met either Yul or Ozzy. So they hadn't played together. And Rebecca says, Yul, you've dominated this game from a strategic perspective. Ozzy, you've dominated this game from a physical perspective in the challenges. And, like back then, compared with now, I'm not surprised that that would carry so much weight with the jury. But I also think it's just kind of ridiculous. Like some people have physical skills that others don't coming into the game. Like I'm glad that we're not just voting for the challenge beast to win nowadays. But I do know that was a consideration for Ozzy. That was his biggest selling point, beyond the fact that he was cool. Of course, again, I mentioned he was a lot cooler in the hot tub with Queen Parv than Yul. Yul was a little freaked out.
That's how you secure a jury vote.
I will also mention
1000%.
here that Yul does not get Jenny's jury vote, who was started on the same tribe as him. She never even lived with Ozzy, still votes for him over Yul. I think that's like, again, like, if Yul is Mr. Perfect, again, perfection's a high standard to meet. I feel like that's an area of weakness.
Jenny's imperfect.
I'd also mention that he's totally caught off guard with the mutiny, right? Candace mutinies because she describes it as the railroads are more fun, which I agree. And that's like Yul again. Why is he not connecting enough to keep these people there? The God Idol, of course, as well as another thing that really helped him. But to be fair, also they had opportunities to flush it out and they just didn't. So
right.
Yul, I think, should get a lot of credit for figuring those things out too. But I did want to make sure we at least acknowledge some of his weaknesses. I'll mention here in a thread called Yul Kwan is the best social player ever. Changed my mind. Someone's comment says Yul's biggest issue, and I think Candace addresses this in her recap podcast with Rob, is that Yul's not organically funny. He's very serious a lot of the time, and he talks to you as if he answers a physics problem. He's a little stoic, and I think that can hurt him in the game of Survivor. And I think that's probably his greatest weakness overall, because Survivor really is about kind of adapting to people. You compare him to someone like Parvati, also considered a very strong social player. You know, it's not exactly 100% the same, but I still think he's still one of the best of all time. And I thought it was important for us to mention those things.
Kevin, was there anything else on your current consensus research that you wanted to share before we moved on to some of the historical views of you?
Well, I do want to mention that there was a Reddit poll in 2016 asking, so that's like the first 32 seasons or so, and everyone was ranked on this. And Yul has one appearance because he only exists one time, and this Winners at War had not happened yet. So, Matt, where do you think Yul placed? Do you think he was in the top 10% of contestants, the top 50, bottom half? Was he popular on Reddit? What do you think?
This is a good question. And this is just about his popularity amongst the
people are asked on a scale of 0 to 10. What do
I
you
mean,
give him?
I would say that the most Yule answer would be to predict that he's about, around the 50% mark. But 32 seasons in, we got a lot of meaty stuff between when he played and that time. I mean, almost 20 seasons worth. So I'm gonna say that Yule was at about the 50% mark.
Okay, so you think he's a middling popularity?
Yeah, I would say middling. And I think that he could be a lot higher. Like, I think he would have been a lot higher definitely right after his season. But the game evolved so much that we saw a lot more players after Yule that had those gamebot tendencies, had the strategic gameplay. I mean, not a Cat Ederson or anything to that extent, but we did get a lot more of those folks. So yeah, I would say about 50% of the way, but I would rank him much higher.
So, I think that Reddit, especially at the time, was a place that was like really, really big on strategy, very heavy on strategy. This is like the immediate aftermath of like the Tony Vlachos era, right? So I think that Yul's going to be pretty high because of that. I think he is a winner that is well respected. And because he hasn't returned yet, I think that there's also this like sense of mystery a little bit around Yul of like, what if there was no God idol? It's been so long since we've seen him. What would that look like? So I feel like he's top 10%. That's my guess.
Out of 575 characters, Yul Kwan was ranked 21st.
Whoa.
So top 25, very, very popular.
Okay. I thought you were going to give me the percentage too. But yeah, top 25 makes sense.
Top 25
is like 5%. Top 5%, right?
He's ranked as the number one person from Cook Islands, beating out all other members of his cast. And then in 2020, there was a Survivor Legends cast where, Reddit users voted on which men and women they wanted to see compete on a Legend season. Yul clocked in at 11th. Which is pretty good. Over 40 seasons, he's considered the 11th, most treasured male legend. Ranking around Ozzy, who was 10th.
Of just men.
So
he just misses the cast.
He's like the alternate in this universe. But that's pretty impressive, I think. So I just want to mention that Yul is very popular, especially in the Reddit corner of the universe, which has a high value for strategy.
Well, that's good to know. Shout out to Reddit. I don't know anything about what Reddit's doing, and I prefer to keep it that way. But thank you for diving in.
Yeah, so I now kind of want to get to the historic legacy of Yul. Kind of what was he like at the time? Matt, what do you remember?
Ooh, so
was he do you remember him being very popular?
I mean, I remember him being pretty popular. And, I think it's also, everything's contextual. So how Yul compares with his other cast members and the season and all the casts for the seasons prior to him is very different than how he would compare with the casts that would follow him, because we would get more characters that had shades of Yul. But again, like Yul to me held up as a pretty strong strategic player, a strategic force, a dominant, some might say perfect force for, about the next, I'd say at least the next 20 seasons. After Game Changers, I feel like we got so much more of that strategic gameplay. And so maybe that's changed. Maybe there are others who get higher up on that list, but Yul's solid. Like, again, the worst thing that I think folks could say about him is that he's boring and not exciting, but he played an incredible game.
Yeah. And I actually looked up his popularity kind of at the time. On the Survivor Wiki, it references that Yul made several notable lists in 2006 and 2007, including People's Magazine's Sexiest Men Alive, People Magazine's Hottest Bachelors, and Extra TV's Most Eligible Bachelors. And on an online poll by Entertainment Weekly, found Yul Kwan to be the favorite Survivor winner amongst its readers, which I think is a little bit of recency bias, considering that like Tom Westman was also a winner. There were a lot of very popular winners, but I remember coming off of Cook Islands, it made sense that Yul should have been on Micronesia or Heroes versus Villains or something in the near future because he was so big, and only the people that really appreciated the camp characters started kind of critiquing him.
So the takeaway is that Yul was sexy and single.
Sexy, smart, and single. That was it. And they kept asking, do you like Becky?
I'm sorry, say that again?
That Jeff was like asking at the reunion.
Oh,
so do you like Becky? Is it romantic? Is there? And Yul's always like, it's professional.
My God.
Very Yul.
He had to, keep repeating that. He's like, I might win all these titles on People Magazine. I can't have people thinking I'm dating Becky.
Yeah.
Well,
wow.
Bachelor.
Nah, and
Becky deserves better. Come on, like I know that
not
Yul's
after that fire making challenge. She doesn't.
Oh my gosh! Like, I mean, she at least was able to use the matches. Come on.
I think they should bring Becky in every fire making challenge in the new era to compete against the contestants, just to see what happens.
This is not right. It's not fair. Like there were shenanigans there. By the way, that was the best moment of the season, easily. The most iconic moment of the season.
And people say Becky and Sandra don't offer anything. They gave us that.
So you know how people always joke that like at the Olympics they want to see one normal person competing next to so that you can see the true difference there. That's why we have Becky in that like third
don't do that
podium
to Becky
for fire making.
Yeah.
But she'll just get really good over time.
And here's my thing with Becky, because I loved Becky because she was an Asian American woman and I was team root for all Asians, right? So like I was definitely rooting for Becky, and this idea that maybe she's being under-edited. She's clearly a partner with Yul. But there was this really damning moment where Yul is talking to Becky about should they get rid of Jonathan Penner around the final 7 or so? Because Adam and Parvati are essentially saying, if you vote out Penner, we'll vote for you on the jury. Adam actually follows through on this. Parvati does not. No one talks about it, but there's a conversation. So Yul's telling Becky, well, if I get rid of Penner, then I'll get 2 more victory votes, for the jury. And Becky kind of just like agrees with him. I'm like, Becky, girl, where's your game? Well, you're just like being a doormat for him, in a way that I get it. You want to see someone like Yul win, but Becky, I wish you wanted to see you win. And so I've always kind of had an issue reflecting on Becky's strategic agency at times, but, to not make this a You Thought You Knew Becky Lee podcast, I will continue on. So there was an article from EW. This was from Dalton Ross, who is still very active in Survivor coverage. And this was during the finale. Dalton writes, let's talk about Yul. He won. And as I've been saying all season, he deserves it. He controlled the game when he was down and up in the numbers. He was stunningly able to pull off all of these moves without really pissing anyone off, which was Boston Rob's downfall in All Stars. All that said, I couldn't have raised much of a ruckus if Ozzy had taken home the title. The guy was just plain sick in terms of both providing food and dominating challenges. Together, Yul and Ozzy made for the strongest final 2. And then in parentheses, he says, let's not even discuss Becky. And he goes,
catching strays.
These are the final catching strays, Becky Lee. Even years later, It says Yul and Ozzy were the strongest final two ever. Yes, even stronger than Tina and Colby. So I think that really is a testament to Yul's popularity and the sense of perfection that he was associated with back in 2006, 2007.
I mean, I think we'd all be so lucky to play a game as well as Yul did in Cook Islands.
Yeah,
absolutely. And you know what? I would like to think Becky could make a fire now. Like, she has to be able to make fire now.
Unless it was like so traumatizing that she never wants to try fire making again, right?
She probably doesn't even cook anymore because
electric stoves only. No fire.
Gosh.
Oh my God.
We'll find out the answer one day.
Someone ask Becky.
I also found an article from SF Gate from the finale time, also published, I think, in San Mateo. And in it, Yul is referenced, quoted, and the article is, Survivor winner hopes he shattered some Asian stereotypes. And it opens with, on his way to winning the reality show Survivor, Yul Kwon solved puzzles, earned the nickname the Godfather for his strategy, and helped smash stereotypes about Asian American men in the media. It also goes on to say, in the finale that aired on Sunday, Yul Kwan of San Mateo won the show's 13th season, which began by pitting African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and whites against one another on 4 different teams. By the end, Kwan made deals and alliances with people of all 4 ethnicities. And goes on to say, it quotes Yul, I hope this might have shown your ethnic background does not dictate who you are and who you're friends with. Kwan said Sunday night during the live show following Survivor, quote, it was a multicultural collaboration, which is the most
collaboration
Yul Kwan quote I have ever seen. It's giving Gamebot, y'all, okay?
Give him a statue. Or
it's giving
something.
AI.
I mean, he's ready to be anybody's press secretary, ready to be spokesperson.
Totally.
He's so pumped.
It's super perfect. And that's
It's,
something I think we crave.
actually.
But I just really stood out to me.
It's giving AI.
That Yul was really, loved for breaking stereotypes and that Asian men can be sexy. Something I'm still fighting to prove to this day.
No. Oh my gosh.
But like, I think it makes sense that Yul was so popular because he broke all those stereotypes. And I think like an attractive Asian man trying to do this today wouldn't have the same, I think, reverence, even though they're still doing a really important, role in media representation. So
we also should just appreciate that this season of Cook Islands could have been the last season of Survivor. If things were just problematic enough, if, there were a few racial incidents and the like, I mean, they would have edited out any slurs and other things, but like this could have been the last season of Survivor if not for someone like Yul, if not for having very, I don't want to say respectable, but having very like relatable,
like aspirational, almost
aspirational characters to the general public, because we also have to remember that this season was viewed as being this really controversial, problematic thing going into it. I remember that around the marketing and how people were talking about it, and even after the fact, how some people talk about Cook Islands, those who probably haven't watched the season too closely, like still might talk about it like that because of the twist. And so it's almost like Yul served this function and played the perfect role for Survivor producers. They weren't looking for the flashiest winner. They were just looking to prove that their social experiment of race war could somehow be acceptable on TV. And they did it worked out. It worked out.
I mean, I think you're totally right, Matt. Like the show lost a bunch of their major sponsors, and it's easy to imagine that even if they had the exact same product, maybe if they had a little bit more like skittish executives higher up, they could have decided that like, that's it. You already drove all of our money away here, right? Production had to have been thrilled that they got to showcase Yul as the winner because he's just so polished and just like ready for TV.
And he's the perfect answer, for
totally.
that situation, which I think means that's also why he was so popular too. And Earl, who also has a very racially diverse season himself, is also kind of similar in that Yul lane, I think, as well. Yes. Professional, well-spoken, can speak about race in ways that don't feel particularly divisive, accessible.
Mhm.
And I think they have a real importance to it. But I think that kind of wraps up my historical kind of coverage here. So we can kind of start wrapping this entire thing up, Nigel, and evaluating Yul's legacy as a character.
Okay, I first want to open with a comment, Kev. You had mentioned the continuous references to Yul as the Godfather, which, as I think about it, is actually fascinating because Yul does not give Godfather at all, right? Like Boston Rob gives Godfather. You think of like the mastermind, the person who's really like sitting in their power, and Yul just feels so matter of fact about things, right? And it's like he gets the title of Godfather because he has so much power, but I don't think that's how Yul carries himself at all while he's out there. I think that there was a reference you made earlier, Matt, about maybe I'm misremembering here, but going back to the self-interested rational player description he gives of Jonathan Penner,
Yeah.
that is, I think, inherently acknowledging that, like, that's Jonathan Penner. He is very self-interested. This is how he's going to react, and that is what makes him different than some of these other players. I think that is an inherent acknowledgement of, emotion of these other people, and not seeing them just as chess pieces, but being able to just understand how all the different people are coming together. And so that really just reminded me of the description you gave at the very beginning of the Gamebot and how we have different views of what that even means. Kevin, having gone through all of this information, are you feeling like you are leaning in a different direction at all about Yul being a Gamebot, or do you feel just as convinced as you were at the beginning?
I think Yul's a Gamebot. I mean, I think he's like what all Gamebots should aspire to be, which is first to win. To be a Gamebot and not win, that's pretty embarrassing. I mean, you really want to be a Gamebot who succeeds, in the show.
Yeah.
But we still get senses of Yul's relationships with people. He talks about his heritage. He gets personal details, but he's just a little bit even keeled, which I think kind of adds that kind of calculated, analytical Gamebot-ness of him. But yeah, I think he's still a Gamebot.
We really only briefly touched on this, actually, Matt, you bringing it up, but in his Winners at War outing, I think that as we look in the rear view mirror several years later at this point, I think it's very difficult to argue that Yul's story was not about Stacy and his relationship to Jonathan Penner. And that is some of the least connected game content I think that we really ever get with Yul Kwan. And I think that it was a really powerful experience, just hearing him and getting to see, actually, I believe that they showed photos of Penner with his family, which becomes much more common from 41 on. But I think that's actually maybe the first inkling that the editing is starting to move in that direction. But Matt, what was your whole take on seeing this type of outing from Yul? Because I think we probably should get a little more into his Winners at War experience before we wrap things up here.
In a lot of ways, it felt like a different Yul, a more relatable, more modern Yul. So many other players had caught up to him from a strategic perspective that I just think he stood out less from the Gamebot standpoint. I mean, he was surrounded by folks who, including Kim Spradlin, who we've talked about, who played the game so masterfully from the strategic standpoint, including some other Gamebots on the cast, right? So that to me wasn't highlighted so much in Winners at War, but we did get a lot of Yul over the course of, he was around in the game for a while. Then, of course, he was on the Edge, so we got to see him there. We got to see him at the Loved Ones visit, so just different side of Yul. And I liked not getting the super strategic, in control Godfather type of edit from Yul there, because he wasn't the Godfather there. He wasn't strategically leagues above everyone else. He was just Yul, as he said, transported or time bombed ahead about about like a lot of years, basically. So I don't, it was a lot different. I don't know if you felt like it was a similar version of Yul or different, but to me, it just felt so much different than his first outing.
And I really liked Yul in Winners at War, and I think the Stacy Penner story of it all is so powerful. I definitely was crying, watching that, and it was also beautiful to see Yul kind of talk about those things, and in true Yul fashion, he understands the power of platform. Like he recognizes that there are cameras around and that can be used. He's kind of like Katniss Everdeen, if you will. Like he's just like, super aware of what it means to be on this show and how you can really affect, greater change. So I really liked Yul in Winners at War. But I think, again, kind of talking about his like perfection issues, some of my favorite moments are when Yul is being challenged about his sense of perfection. So, or when he's being pushed back. So one of my favorite Yul moments outside of the Penner Stacy of it all is when he wants to form a foursome alliance, because of course he does. And he wants Wendell.
Hey, he knows that it works. Right?
Wendell, Nick, Sophie.
Yeah.
And of course he wants them, right? He doesn't want Sandra. He doesn't want the flashy people. No, he wants those
predictable people.
Exactly. Yeah. Management consultant. And he tells Sophie, I think it'd be good if we worked each other. And Sophie like stops and Yul just keeps talking. He goes, you could punctuate that a little bit more. Like you just ask me part of a deal. You can be excited about it, but that's not Yul. But like that moment works because Yul is a little game bot, in my opinion. He can kind of like smell the roses a little bit in that moment. Or his the other moment that reminds me of this is in the Cook Islands when they're hanging from the poles, right? And Penner talks about his feet being too big and it's hard. And Yul goes, Jonathan might be onto something, because we all have about the same amount of surface area. And it's like a physics problem. It's like why elephants can't run up trees, which is like, Yul, just say your feet are big. Like, I don't understand why we have to do all this, but it's so Yul. And it cuts to Yul being like, I'm never going to get a date again. And, it's those moments where he kind of reflects on the fact that he is a little stilted and professional and performing so much that I find is so endearing. And I just wish we got to see more of that. And I do think we get a lot more of that in Winners at War. And I'm so glad that Yul got to return to Survivor to show us a bit more of who he is. But I think at his core, he's still Gamebot.
Yeah.
So Matt, what do you think?
Please.
Is Yul a Gamebot?
I feel like I'm screaming like Carolyn. Like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. But you know what? Yul is definitely an introvert. Definitely a very introverted person. Definitely a more shy person. I know just in more of what I heard from him, he talked about navigating social anxiety at points of his life. So there's a lot that I think makes the character that we see in Cook Islands, and tons of growth from Cook Islands to Winners at War. Naturally, that's how humans work. But I mean, I think you kind of convinced me to go with this Gamebot Plus approach, because no, Yul is not a Gamebot. is Yul a Gamebot Plus, bringing in some of that empathy, the emotion, trying to figure out what emotions are? Like, to me, Yul is a lot like Jeff Probst at a loved one's visit. Like, what are relationships? What is sister? Like, that's Yul to me. But he actually does have a good understanding of people and relationships and emotions. He's not great at depicting it, and that contributes to his Gamebot depiction. He is so much more than Gamebot, but he is a Gamebot. He has all of those, basic elements. I do think the one thing I struggle with is the definition that I shared at the beginning of being devoid of emotion and empathy. That doesn't really capture Yul, but that's just one definition. So, like, screw it. Gamebot Plus, baby. And again, I think $9.99. I'd pay $19.99 for Yul once a month. That works out pretty well.
Yeah, and I think that you're totally right. I think the devoid of human empathy is a pretty severe depiction, but I think if we go with a more loose term in which people kind of, if there's like a Gamebot a season, if it's that frequent, I think Yul is a pretty fitting person for that. But I think Yule actually has a great understanding of human relationships. He's able to kind of detect that, how people work with one another. I just think his delivery of that information tends to makes him, to me, a Gamebot character, because he is so level-headed, and it's almost like like I said, I'm reading AI. But Nige, what do you think?
I think that Gamebot Plus is probably the best way to think about it, because is Yul like in the archetype of a Gamebot? I would say yes, definitely. But especially when you add in the Winners at War outing, I think that there is enough of a nuance that it exists that I'm not comfortable saying that like Yul's like an easy game bot. When I think of some of the past game bots of Survivor history, Yul is not really at the top of that list for me by any means. There is a little bit of nuance, but so to go with Gamebot Plus, I think that's a fair acknowledgement that so much of it was strategic content focused, and so clean and reserved, and really just like withholding the rougher edges that we all have that really put us at risk for not winning Survivor for all of our flaws, but Yul just has this special something there. And I think that that's why he's a game bot who is a beloved winner of the show. Many game bots, embarrassingly, Kevin, don't actually win the show.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think we should like challenge the notion that, it's not bad to be a game bot, right? I think you should strive to be at least Game Bot Plus if you can.
Yeah.
But like in general, there's nothing wrong with being a game bot, because, so much of Survivor is also the situations you're in. I mean, you can be situationally interesting, I think Spencer is a game bot. I think Kelly Wentworth are game bots, but like, they're also really rootable underdogs. And it's fun to have the underdog be analytical about the game and explain that to us so we understand it and can root for them and support them. And I don't really care about your sob story and having personal content if you're making interesting game related decisions. And so that is a totally fair way to like appreciate and watch a character. So I feel like, yes, Yul Kwan is a game bot, but there's no shame in being a game bot.
Yes. And I would just say, from the perspective of, let's imagine there are listeners who are just binging You Thought You Knew because they want to go on Survivor. I think one of the lessons that they should take away from this conversation is that if you're looking at Yul and you view him as just a game bot, just a strategic beast who used that to get to the end, that wasn't the only ingredient that Yul had to work with. And because of his legacy, which has been so tied, other than being tied to him being one of the sexiest men alive, clearly, his legacy being tied to being the strategic mastermind, I think has influenced a lot of players to go out there and lead with the strategy, lead with the game bot, but not with the plus. And so I would say don't forget that you need that plus. You can't just be the game bot if you want to win the game. Like I would say, my hot take, we've never seen a game bot win, or maybe Kim Spradlin. Okay, maybe we will see one game bot win, but other than that, have we ever? I don't know. Most times we don't. That's a good statement. Yes, most times we haven't seen a game bot win, because you need more than that to do it.
And I think Kim is someone who also has empathy and has all those things.
Totally.
I think unfortunately the editors just don't really, showcase all of her personality,
Exactly.
And I think that would, if I could ask them to like re-edit one world and showcase that personality a bit more, I think Kim would be even more captivating. And she still won fan favorite that season and $1 million. So like, Gamebots can truly succeed even if there are some haters out there. But
I mean, the competition was not strong in one world. But you know what? And speaking of Kim, I know this is not an episode about Kim, but like, look at her at Winners at War. Like, just off the top of my head, because I didn't go in and dive in and talk study Kim for this, but she just seemed so overwhelmed with all the dynamics and everything that was happening. That was her main trait as a character in that season. And I think that goes to show, like, if you are dealt cards that are different and you don't have other cards to play, if you don't have other, tricks to pull out of your sleeves, then like maybe you'll just be like sitting on the floor of the jungle crying and upset and overwhelmed.
And I loved seeing Kim uncharacteristically flailing to the ground, begging for her life to stay in the first few episodes, because that's so not Kim. It's so human to like struggle and be vulnerable. And I think one exciting thing about Winners at War is that, you know, a lot of the winners do get kind of sterilized, cleaner edits because you have to make them likable enough or respectable enough to the audience. And so to see a lot of those people, you know, lose meant we also got to see them also be a bit more human and less gamebot. And I think that's what happened with Yul. So, Nigel, is there anything left for us to discuss? You have any hot takes?
No, I think that was actually a lovely cherry on top of the discussion there. It's been a pleasure to talk about Yul and revisit. I think, you know, Yul seems to be the grandson that every grandmother wants, you know, like he's just like
Hot
the
take.
nicest boy who cares about other people
take.
and wants to donate $1 million if he wins it, right? What's not to love about Yul?
Yeah.
Matt, any closing thoughts on Yul?
No, I you know, I think that there's so much more to what makes Yule nice, other than wanting to donate the money. You know, some people would donate the money, not great people. But no, I love Yule. I think he's phenomenal. I hope he's still working for the FBI. I hope he's an FBI agent. I hope he's also still juggling jobs with Google and also like getting extra degrees and winning sexiest men alive awards. Like, just I want the best things in the world for Yul, but I think he already is just going out and taking them for himself. So nothing else to say about him, but he ages incredibly well, not only literally, but his legacy does as well. So it's fun to talk about him. And thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining, Matt. There you have it, folks. Yul Kwan. Matt, do you have anything to promote coming up? Anything you want to share?
Do I ever? Oh my gosh. Yeah, I just came back with a couple of podcasts here on the Rhap as a Podcast Network. One of them is the Wrestling Rhap Up, which features me, the one and only Mari Forth, talking about professional wrestling each and every week. We just came back from a little bit of a hiatus, and we'll be not only going with the podcast through WrestleMania, which is happening in April, but we'll actually be going to WrestleMania. Oh my gosh. Wah, 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 wah. I don't know if there's like a sound effect or anything for that. Oh,
I just have a bell. That's the best thing I got. Sorry.
Okay, it's a good bell. That's a great bell. So yeah, we are back talking pro wrestling. Have a lot of exciting guests lined up this season from the wrestling fandom and the like. So check that out at robhiswebsite.com/wrestling feed and subscribe. Also, check out my podcast, Pod Friends, on this network. I actually just released the season premiere featuring the one and only Bryce Isaiah. And you know what? So much great feedback for that episode. I'd encourage everyone to listen to that, to check that out at robhiswebsite.com/podfriendsfeed. And otherwise, follow me at MattScottGW. Send your hate tweets to Kevin and Nigel. But if you have nice things to say to me, you could tweet me, whatever, reach out. And again, awesome to be here. But like, where could the people find you? What do you two have coming up? I want to know. The people want to know.
Kev, what do we have coming up this season?
So we have our brand new season of You Thought You Knew. We all 5 episodes in total. This is the first one. Our next 2 episodes in the pipeline. We will be talking to Gia Worthy, answering the question, is Candace Cody actually a hero? And we'll be also talking with Matt Scott's co-host, Mari Forth, where we'll answer the question, can Amanda Kimmel win? So both...
You are messed up for that one. How dare you? Bring her back. Bring her back.
A 4th time?
Yeah, we're probably overdue. Right?
Yeah. She's like clockwork. But it'll be really fun to discuss those. I can't wait to discuss them with our great guests. And if you're interested in other You Thought You Knew episodes, after you listen to Bryce on Pod Friends, you should definitely listen to Bryce's episode with us, where we answer the question, is Rob Cesternino a gay icon? Which I think
yes.
Spoiler, yes. Which I think will also be great. So if you really liked You Thought You Knew, had thoughts, questions, ideas, concerns, opinions about what is a gamebot or Yul Kwan being one. You can also contact me at Asian Narcissist on Instagram or at Asian Narc on Twitter.
You cannot find me online because I'm taking a break from Twitter, and it has been a good choice for me. We'll see how long it lasts, but it's what's happening for now. So any comments, hate, don't direct it to Matt, direct it to Kevin. Love you.
Love you too, babe.
All right, folks, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye, babes.